When it comes to President Donald Trump, there's always been one hot topic: his hair. Together, we're going to explore how he's been able to maintain such an iconic hairstyle over the years. What role has modern hair transplants played to help him make his hair great again? To start our discussion of President Trump's hair, it's worth looking back at photos of him when he was a really young child, because this gives us an idea that he had a natural part towards the left. This is where the hairs would divide either left or right on his scalp. Now we take a look at a picture of Trump at the age of 18, and what you're going to notice is that he continues to have that left part to his hairline, and now he's brushing his hair to the right. He has frontal temporal recession, kind of what I have over here. He does have a widow's peak, but what's so amazing is that if we pop up a photo of Barron Trump, his son, at the same age of 18 years old, look at those hairlines. They're almost identical. Barron also has frontal temporal recession slightly. He also has a part on his left, and he's brushing his hair to the right, and he also has that widow's peak. This illustrates that hairlines that we acquire are very much connected to genetics. Yes, Barron does certainly have some of his father's genes. Now, if we look at a photo of Trump's father, Fred Trump, from the 1970s, you can clearly see he has a regressed hairline. This is classic androgenetic alopecia, male pattern baldness. But then, fast forward in the 90s, somehow his hairline has lowered. The question is what's going on, and we're going to discuss this further in the video. I have a hunch that Trump knew that in his early 30s he was at more and more risk for losing hair. And to camouflage that he had hair loss, he tried to change how he combed his hair so that he could camouflage the frontal temporal recession that he was experiencing. No one could really tell from these photos, and that's what he was trying to accomplish. But clearly, we know what's going on if you're watching this video. Now at the age of 32, we see something very interesting. His hairline is lower than it was when he was younger, and it's straight. It doesn't have that irregular look to it, which would normally be completely normal. A straight hairline is not something you really want to see. And it's at this point that I really think that he had his first hair transplant. Now, it was the 1970s, and there weren't a lot of hair surgeons around like there are today. So the likely person that performed this surgery was probably Dr. Norman Orentreich, who was in New York City and who pioneered hair plugs. You take hair from the back of the donor area and plant it to the front. Very similar to what we do today. The difference is when we do follicular unit extraction, FUE, we take follicular units. We take 1, 2, 3, or 4 hairs. The punch sizes they used to take were 15 hairs or 20 hairs, and then they would be sutured to the front of the scalp. The problem is that if you take a close look at Donald's hairline now, at this stage in his life, it looks very doll-like, and that was one of the downsides of doing hair plugs. It would create this pluggy look to the hairline. Unfortunately, these hair plugs were placed too low, causing the hairline to be way too low for his age. His hair is forced to be combed forward, and this really is not the type of look you should aspire for if you're going for a hair transplant. Now, if we break Trump's face into thirds with the golden triangle ratio, you should have even proportions between these areas. But you can clearly see this is way too narrow. This distance from the glabella to the hairline should be 6 to 7 centimeters. That is a normal distance for a hairline to be away from the glabella. In Trump's case, it's way too narrow. So throughout Trump's 30s, there's really not much of a change since his last hair transplant. His hairline's lower, it's straighter, it still looks unnatural with that plugginess, and sometimes he combs it forward to kind of camouflage that doll-like look from the hair plugs. In 1988, it's very likely that Donald Trump went on a medication known as minoxidil, and that's because this was the only medication that was FDA approved for hair loss in the United States. It works specifically by improving the growth phase of our hair follicles. I made an entire video about this. If you want to learn more about minoxidil, I encourage you to check it out. In the early 1990s, you can notice that Trump continues to have frontal temporal regression. But if you look closely at this photo, you can also notice that there's some scarring. And this makes me think at this stage, he probably had another hair transplant. In this case, I think he had a rotational flap. Now, the two popular techniques at this time were hair plugs, which we talked about earlier, and rotational flaps. Rotational flaps involve removing areas of the scalp and transitioning them in areas where there's balding. And this is exactly what I think Trump had. Now, the benefits of a rotational flap are that you can move thousands of hair follicles in one fell swoop, and you can get instantaneous results. The downside is you can get scarring, which is exactly what I think he's experienced at this stage. Only a year after having this potential rotational flap, we see that he's still combing his hair forward. And it's probably because he's trying to camouflage the scar, maybe from the rotational flap, or the hair plugs that he had earlier. Now, the other thing to take notice of is his hairline continues to go lower. And remember, if we follow the golden triangle of the face, this is not the ratio that one should aspire to if they want to have a hair transplant. And then we look at Fred Trump. And what's so funny is that it looks like they both had rotational flaps done at the same exact time. Now remember, Fred Trump had a hairline that went all the way back. Now his hairline's over here. So clearly something happened. It looks like he has this mild scar on the front, and his hair is going posteriorly, which is very typical for a rotational flap. In 2002, we see Trump's frontal temporal recession is almost gone in the pictures. And so this makes me think he likely had what's called an FUT hair transplant procedure. This would be his third hair transplant. And this involves taking a strip of hair from the back of the scalp and cutting it underneath a microscope into follicular units, 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s, and transplanting it to the front. And this would have benefited Trump because if he had rotational flaps where there were micro scars in the front of the hairline, this would have helped to camouflage those scars. But what we see is that by 2009, he actually doesn't maintain that density that he had in the early 2000s. He starts to lose that density. And the question is, what does he do next? If there's one thing we can appreciate about Donald Trump, it's that he really does care about how he looks. So he went from having thin hair, and then around 2010, 2011, we start to notice his hair density gets thick again. And it's at this point that I believe he actually had his fourth hair transplant. Yes, fourth hair transplant. And this time, I think he had an FUE performed, follicular unit extraction. This is where individual follicular units of hairs, 1s, 2s, 3s, or 4s, are removed from the back of the donor area and placed in the front. This technique is now the most popular technique performed for hair transplants around the world, and clearly, Donald probably took advantage of it. Now, of course, we can appreciate that he continues to have that left scar. And I'm sure you've seen these photos and videos of his hair flopping in different directions. And again, that's likely because of the rotational flaps. And there's also a sign from a scar on the right side that he also had a rotational flap in that area as well. So it is likely that in the early 2000s, he did have a right and left rotational flap with a scalp reduction to join the rotational flaps together to improve overall density. Between you and me, I think President Trump likely had 5 hair surgery procedures performed over the course of his life. Hair plugs, 2 rotational flaps, FUT, and then FUE. And he did this to maintain the density of his hair and keep and maintain a youthful appearance. If you have any questions about hair transplants that I have not addressed, or specifically Donald Trump's hair transplant, leave them in the comments below, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.